most of what we've been able to learn about the human brain has come as a result of something very horrific happening to some very unlucky person. And over the years, this has happened enough times that the medical community has been able to piece together a better picture of what different parts of the brain do. One of the most famous of these unfortunate fellows was Phineas Gage. His injury was gruesome, so get ready. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. If it's not obvious, I'm not a brain surgeon. But as always, all of my sources are linked down below. Okay, you guys, YouTube just came out with something really cool for small creators. It doesn't cost you anything, but allows you to support your small creators, and it's called Hype. So this is a feature that allows you to click a hype button, and it is only available to creators who are under 500,000 subscribers. So it's supposed to promote smaller channels and help them get out there more. If you have access to this feature, you have so much hype you can give each week. Like I said, it's free to do. It's not like a paid thing. If you guys want to check and see if you have that feature, this is how you do it. Now, if you're on this screen, you may have to hit a drop down and even scroll to get to the hype button, but then you'll see it right here. So it just kind of looks like a little star, and it will also say hype from some screens. Again, not everyone has this yet because YouTube is just rolling it out. You can go and spread the love around to different creators, or you can give all of your hype for the week to one particular creator. If you guys would like to give me a hype, I would love that. Thank you so much, and let's get on with the episode. If my mouth is moving weird during this video, it's because I have a massive cold sore on my lips, so disregard that. If I look like I'm talking funny, that's why. Phineas Gage was born the eldest of 5 siblings in Grafton County, New Hampshire. While there isn't much known about his childhood, we do know that he received some sort of education because he was able to read and write. As an adult, he was 5 foot 6 inches tall and had a muscular build. He was known to be healthy, strong, and active. The town doctor, Dr. John Harlow, said that Phineas had scarcely had a day's illness from childhood. We also know that Phineas had a knack for explosives, and it's thought that he may have worked with them as a youth on farms or possibly in nearby mines and quarries. In 1848, at the age of 25, Phineas was employed on the construction of the Hudson River Railroad. By that September, he was the blasting foreman, which it's thought that he may have been working as an independent contractor. Phineas was described as a shrewd, smart businessman who was energetic and persistent in executing all his plans of operation. Explosives have been used for clearing rock and earth since the 9th century. Today, this practice continues with dynamite and other explosives being set and then detonated using electrical charges. The process hasn't changed a whole lot since Phineas's day. Back then, a hole would be bored into the rock. The deepest section would be filled with blasting powder, and then, to focus the explosive force, the powder and fuse would be gently tamped down with the tamping iron, which was basically like a specialized crowbar where one end was larger, and that was the part that was used for tamping. Sand was then added, and a more vigorous tamping was applied. After that, the fuse would be lit and the whole thing would go boom. Now, this whole process was very similar to how muskets and cannons were loaded back in the day. One of Phineas's jobs as the foreman was to decide where the holes would be drilled in the rock and how much powder to put for the charge. Phineas was said to be very good at his job and had even commissioned his own custom-made tamping iron, which was tapered off at one end. This was a 3 foot 7 inch long iron rod that weighed about 13.5 pounds and was 1.25 inches around, and it was tapered down to a point on one end that was about 1/4 of an inch in size. It basically looked like a small javelin. On September 13th, 1848, Phineas and his crew were building the bed for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad in central Vermont. He and his gang were blasting a cutting through the large rocky outcrop. Around 4:30 p.m., some of Phineas's men were loading some busted rock into a cart and apparently distracted him. Now, accounts differ a little bit on how exactly this happened after Phineas turned his head. One account says Phineas tried to tamp the gunpowder down while his head was still turned, and he scraped his iron against the side of the hole, which created a spark. Another account says Phineas's assistant, who was perhaps also distracted, failed to pour the sand into the hole, And when Phineas turned back, he smashed the rod down hard, thinking he was packing inert material, and created a spark that way. Regardless of the exact way that it happened, Phineas's tamping iron created a spark that shot down into the hole, igniting the gunpowder. The resulting explosion shot the tampering iron up and out with such great force that it shot through the left side of Phineas's face. It traveled up past the outside of his upper jaw, behind his left eye, and up through the left side of his brain, exiting through the frontal bone portion of his skull. The bar then landed 82 feet or 25 meters away. It was covered in blood and brain matter. Phineas was thrown to the ground and went into spasms for a few minutes. According to Phineas, he never lost consciousness. After the convulsions were over, Phineas simply sat upright, was talking, and then walked unassisted and climbed into the ox cart. Phineas was taken to a nearby town where he had been staying at a hotel. He sat upright the entire way. Once at the hotel, Phineas Gage got out of the cart, again unassisted, and went and sat on a chair that was on the veranda of the hotel and just waited for the town doctor to arrive. Before he arrived, a traveling physician named Edward H. Williams happened to pull up and saw Phineas sitting there bleeding out, basically. Phineas, who had been sitting there telling the story of what happened to him, saw the doctor and said, "Doctor, here is business enough for you." The doctor said that he first noticed the wound on Phineas's head before he even got out of his carriage. He said he could see the brain pulsing. Now, fair warning, all of this is a bit gross, so listen at your own risk or feel free to skip ahead. He said it appeared somewhat like an inverted funnel, as if some wedge-shaped body had passed from below upward so that the pieces of the skull had come out and formed a sort of TP shape at the top of his head. Or as another account put it, it was like a volcano of upturned bone was jutting out of his scalp. Dr. Williams says that at first he didn't believe Phineas's story of what had happened because he couldn't believe he had lived through all of that, much less the fact that he was actually sitting there talking, telling everyone what had just happened. Right in the middle of his story, Phineas starts feeling sick. So he gets up and vomits, which the pressure from his vomiting caused about half a teacup full of brain matter to exit through the hole that was in the top of his head. I told you guys this was gross. So there's just brain matter on the floor now. And the town doctor, Dr. John Harlow, finally arrives about an hour later at around 6 o'clock, and he starts tending to Phineas. Now, I'm not sure what Dr. Williams did in that first hour, but luckily for Phineas, Dr. Harlow had been a military surgeon, so he was the perfect person to handle this type of injury. Dr. Harlow took over Phineas's care with Dr. Williams assisting him. Step 1 was to stop the bleeding. He shaved the scalp, cleaned the dried blood from the wound, and removed 3 small triangular pieces of frontal bone and also about an ounce of brain tissue that was protruding through the fracture. I don't know why, but every time I hear the word brain matter or brain tissue, it just turns my stomach. That's definitely supposed to be on the inside, right? Then with one index finger in each of the openings, he searched inside the skull for the other pieces of the bone. Throughout all of this, Phineas was retching every 20 minutes because blood and what was reported as greasy bits of brain kept slipping down the back of his throat and gagging him. Just don't think too deeply about it. This is another one of those times when I'm like, God bless the people who do these jobs. Reports say that Phineas never got ruffled, remained conscious, and was rational the entire time. The doctors then replaced 2 large pieces of bone that had come detached from his skull and then partially closed the wound using adhesive straps. They didn't close it all the way because obviously they were anticipating that there was going to be some swelling and they wanted to allow for any built-up fluid to drain out. A wet compress was applied along with a nightcap and bandaging. The doctor then dressed the wound on Phineas's cheek and tended to his arms, which had also been badly burned. Once they had made him as comfortable as possible, he was asked if he would like visitors. Phineas said no, as he expected that he would be back to work in a few days. Seems pretty optimistic, but I'm kind of wondering if he was still in shock at this point. Well, technically it's not medically considered a type of shock, but a lot of people refer to your body's fight or flight response after an accident as being in shock. So I have a bad habit of calling it shock when really what it is that fight or flight response where your body will flood your system with hormones like adrenaline adrenaline and endorphins after a traumatic injury, and then you won't immediately feel pain, or the pain is dulled to the point that it's bearable. So last time I made a video talking about someone being in shock after a traumatic event, people in the comments thought that I meant the person was surprised. Though in that case, I think it was a real case of medical shock, and she might also have been a surprise. Regardless, I'm always using that term incorrectly because I've just heard that my whole life. And so, yeah, I don't know. I can't promise I won't say it again in future videos and forget to explain it. But that's what I feel like may have been going on in this case at this point, because it's so hard to believe that this guy wouldn't have been in such excruciating pain that he would have passed out. After refusing visitors, Phineas was put to bed with his head elevated, and it said that he had a pretty good night's rest, which is also hard to believe. I'm thinking they had to have given him something strong. But by the following morning, Phineas was still responding well. He recognized his mother and uncle who had traveled 30 miles to see him. However, the doctor noted that he had considerable swelling and his left eyeball was protruding a good half-inch. And by that evening, he had taken a turn for the worse. He became delirious and was described as having lost his mind. A local cabinet maker measured him for a coffin. I mean, it kind of feels like that could have waited. Over the next several days, his condition was very up and down. One minute he would recognize people, and the next minute he wouldn't. Dr. Harlow described him as having what nowadays we would call an infection, and that lasted for 19 days, during which time he was delirious and even comatose at points. It was discovered that he had a fungal infection that sprouted from his head. Now, if that sounds like mushrooms, it's because it kind of was. Dude had mushrooms sprouting from his brain. Dr. Harlow wrote that the fungi was sprouting from the top of the brain and filling the opening. There was about 8 ounces of discharge from the brain, and the pus was not only coming out of the wound in his head, but also through his mouth and his left eye socket. This was obviously very, very bad. Preparations for his death kicked into full swing as his friends got the coffin ready. Dr. Harlow, however, wasn't ready to give up on him just yet. He continued to clean the wound, cutting away the sprouting fungi, aka the mushrooms, and applied silver nitrate to disinfect the area. 14 days into the crisis, Harlow performed emergency surgery, puncturing the tissue inside Phineas's nose to drain the wound. Things were touch and go for weeks, and Phineas lost sight in his left eye, which was sewn shut. Miraculously, as the days passed by, thanks in a large part to Dr. Harlow's dedication to keeping the wound clean, Phineas didn't die. Instead, he started to improve. By day 23, he was able to raise himself into a sitting position for about 4 minutes at a time. On day 24, he was able to take his first steps. He was then able to get up from bed and walk to a nearby chair. A month in, he was walking around and even taking the stairs. By day 56, Phineas was taking walks around town. And just 10 weeks after this horrific brain surgery, Phineas was not only able to take walks around town, but he actually left the hotel and traveled by carriage to his parents' home in Lebanon, New Hampshire. The closed carriage he rode in was typically used for transporting the insane, and at this point in his healing process, he was still incredibly weak and was described as being feeble, thin, weak, and childish. Once home with his parents, he continued to improve. 6 months after the incident, Dr. Harlow wrote that Phineas was fully recovered. However, he later wrote that Phineas was intellectually impaired. Nothing extreme, just a little slower at things. By February of the following year, roughly 5 to 6 months after his incident, Phineas was able to do some light work around the farm, progressing to the point of being able to work a half day in the fields. By that summer, Phineas attempted to return to his job with the railroad, but his employer stated that they saw a marked change in his personality. They said he was fitful, irreverent, and at times indulged in the grossest profanities, which had not been his custom before, as he was previously known as having possessed a well-balanced mind. During all this time, newspapers started writing stories about him with varying levels of accuracy. Most wrote about him in a very tabloidy type of way, focusing on the sheer improbability of his survival. Doctors also got in on discussing this case, though they were said to have a healthy dose of skepticism. One physician dismissed Phineas as a Yankee invention. And Dr. Harlow described others to be like the Apostle Thomas with Jesus, as they refused to believe that the man had risen until they had thrust their fingers into the hole in his head. Phineas started carrying his tampering iron around with him everywhere he went, and since he was unable to return to work on the railroad, he capitalized on his newfound fame as a way to make money. He started making public appearances, charging 12.5 cents per person. He also made regular appearances at Barnum's American Museum in New York, where, for an extra dime, people could part his hair and see his brain pulsating. Eventually, people started losing interest, and Phineas went to work for a horse stable and coach business in New Hampshire. After working there for about 18 months, Phineas struck out to South America in 1852. He had been recruited by a man who was hoping to take advantage of the gold rush in Chile and wanted to start a stagecoach business there. Once there, Phineas drove heavily loaded down stagecoaches along rugged mountainous trails. He spent close to 8 years transporting passengers in this way. Now, immediately after Phineas's initial recovery, many of his friends and acquaintances said that he was no longer Phineas Gage. Some accounts of his story report that after the accident, he was unable to hold down a job, no longer cared about society norms, and was prone to fits of rage. They paint a picture of an angry and abusive psychopath. However, these accounts also talk about how his wife and children were the ones who bore the brunt of that rage, but Phineas did not have a wife or children. It's also noted that many of these accounts came from former co-workers reporting on how Phineas was immediately after the accident, but the reports were not actually taken down until more than 10 years later. Phineas's family also noted that he was a changed man, but their stories painted him as simply being more childlike. So, if his family's reporting is to be believed, he wasn't a rage-filled monster, he was just more simple. Modern researchers now believe that the accounts told by Phineas's family may have been the more accurate story. One of the many reasons they believe this is because of the type of job that Phineas was able to hold down after the incident. The thought is that if he was some kind of crazy person who was unable to control himself, he would not have been able to hold down a job transporting passengers across hundreds of miles. It's said that the driving of these old-fashioned horse coaches took quite a bit of skill. These coaches were pulled by 6 horses, and the driver had to control each of his horse's reins with a different finger. Just rounding a bend would take quite a bit of dexterity. This would be like driving a car and having to steer each of the wheels independently. In addition to this, the trails Phineas was driving would have been crowded and meant that he had to be very quick at his maneuvering. Not to mention avoiding bandits along the trail and completing the various tasks that would have been required of him to take care of his passengers along the way. So the thought process was that Phineas had either never been as bad as was reported, or he had simply improved over time as his brain healed. Some researchers looking into this case have even suggested that working such a complex job may have acted like a sort of therapy for Phineas's brain and further aided in his healing. The extent of how much Phineas Gage's personality changed has been a matter of debate for many years, and thanks to the conflicting reports, we'll never know the full extent of what happened there. But the fact that his personality did change after having had an injury to a specific part of his brain gave doctors at the time a new insight into how the brain works. Today, we take it for granted that each part of the brain is specialized for certain purposes, but back in Phineas Gage's day, no one was certain of that yet. Many in the medical field at the time saw things more holistically. Basically, they thought that each part of the brain was equally important for every function. There was the thought among those known as phrenologists that personality and intelligence were related to the bumps on the skull. Even though this has been proven wrong and is now considered pseudoscience, Phineas's ability to recover from such a traumatic injury may have been seen by some to support their viewpoints, as he had been able to lose considerable brain matter and still recover. Now, of course, other aspects of his case also could have been used to argue against this, but this is considered one of the reasons that this case became such a big deal in the medical community and why so much has been written about him. The thought is that some of the exaggerated details in this case are as a result of someone trying to prove their own theories on how the brain worked. Research into Phineas's case started in 1849 when the professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School, Henry Jacob Bellow, invited Phineas to Boston for a formal evaluation. Phineas was brought before the Boston Society for Medical Improvement and studied further. Bigelow's report announced Gage quite recovered in his faculties of body and mind. However, as was common in neurological exams at the time, Bigelow probably only considered Phineas's sensory and motor deficits. And because Phineas could walk, talk, see, and hear, Bigelow concluded that his brain must be fine. Bigelow's assessment meshed well with the medical consensus at the time, which held that the frontal lobes didn't do much, in part because people could suffer grave injuries to this part of the brain and walk away. Scientists now know that parts of the frontal lobes contribute to nearly every activity inside the brain. The forefront of the lobes, called the prefrontal area, plays an especially important role in impulse control and planning. However, to this day, scientists have very limited understanding of how the prefrontal lobes exercise that control. At one point, Dr. Harlow recorded that Phineas's memory was as perfect as ever, and another doctor wrote that a stranger would not notice anything unusual about him. A doctor who was seeing him during his time working for the stage company said that he had no impairment whatsoever. However, another thing that we now know is that many people who have had a prefrontal brain injury can have everything that can be measured in a lab, such as memory, language, motor skills, reasoning, intelligence, all of that seem intact. They will seem completely normal to strangers, but when you ask their close friends and family, it's a different story. They are the ones who are acutely aware that something is off. It's said that it's hard to diagnose frontal lobe damage without having known the person well prior to any brain damage because everyone's baseline is so different. While Phineas was considered completely normal by medical standards at the time, Dr. Harlow wrote in 1848 and in another in his report in 1868, summarizing why Phineas's previous contractor would not re-employ him. These reports were pretty brief, with the one from 1868 being about 200 words long. And these writings from Dr. Harlow are considered the only truly reliable sources of how Phineas changed. In his summaries, Dr. Harlow documented some of the changes that were very evident in Phineas's personality for those who knew him before the incident. Phineas, who had previously been very reliable, now no longer followed through with his plans. He would make a plan and then drop him for some other scheme. Post-accident, Phineas also lacked his former business sense and was no longer good with handling money. As noted by his former employer, his courteous personality was replaced with a crudeness that no one had seen before. Dr. Harlow said, "The equilibrium between his intellectual faculties and his animal propensities seemed to have been destroyed." Now, there are multiple different ways that statement could be taken, but the way he's described it sounds as if he had lost some of his intelligence, but also he had lost his ability to maybe read social cues, or maybe he simply no longer cared about what other people thought or wanted. Phineas's mother told Dr. Harlow that Phineas started telling his nieces and nephews wild stories about his supposed adventures, and she didn't believe that any of these stories were rooted in reality. He developed a great fondness for pets and souvenirs, especially for children, horses, and dogs, and all of this was exceeded only by his attachment to his tamping iron, which was his constant companion during the remainder of his life. Unfortunately, by 1859, Phineas's health was declining and he had been forced to quit his job in Chile. He returned to the United States to live with his mother and sister, who were now living in San Francisco. He took a few months to recover, and while his mother and sister were tending to him, he started to get better. He found a job as a farm laborer and seemed to be doing well for a bit. Unfortunately, one day in early 1960, it sounds like he may have pushed things a bit too hard behind the plow and came home completely wiped out. He had a seizure the next day over dinner. After that, he continued to have epileptic seizures that continued to grow in severity and frequency until May of 1860, when he had a very intense seizure that lasted for 5 minutes. Phineas Gage passed away on May 21st at only 36 years of age. His family buried him 2 days later. Now, it's extremely sad to think of him dying so young, but the other side of this is that it was pretty much a miracle that he survived this accident at all, and he was given another 11 and a half years to live. As you can imagine, many people questioned how he had lived so long after such a traumatic injury. Dr. Harlow attributed it to 4 main categories. The fact that he was previously in such good mental and physical shape, the shape of the tamping iron. He said that the fact that it was such a small point at the end meant that it passed through the brain much more easily than a standard, larger tamping iron would have done, and so less damage was done. He also thought that the entry of the tamping iron, the way that it created such a large opening, it was really good for draining the infection, so he said that also helped with the recovery. And lastly, Dr. Harlow also believed that the area of the brain that was injured was the best fitted to sustain this type of injury. Dr. Harlow modestly wrote, "I dressed him, God healed him." Now, Phineas's story may have ended with his death, except for Dr. Harlow. He had lost track of Phineas several years before he passed away, but located the Gage family's address in California and wrote for news of Phineas. Learning about Phineas's death 6 years earlier, Harlow asked the family to exhume his remains so that he could have Phineas's skull to study it further. The family agreed, and in 1867, Phineas's sister, her husband, their family doctor, the city mortician, and even San Francisco's mayor, Dr. Kuhn, were all present as the coffin was unearthed. Phineas's family then hand-delivered the skull and tamping iron, which some reports say was buried with Phineas, to Dr. Harlow in New York a few months later. At this point, Harlow finally wrote up that full case report that I spoke about earlier, which contained most of everything we know about Phineas's mental status. When Dr. Harlow was done with the skull, it was sent to Warren Museum at Harvard Medical School, where visitors came from all over the world to catch a glimpse of it. The logbook at the Harvard Museum has recorded visitors from Syria, India, Brazil, Korea, Chile, Turkey, and Australia within more recent years. Comments on the book include things like, "An odd treat," and "Phineas Gage was on my bucket list." In 2008, the first image of Phineas Gage was discovered. The collectors who had the photo thought that it was of someone who had lost an eye while whaling, but when they posted this photo online with that information, it was kind of like debunked that that's what it could be, and so they started researching, and they were able to discover that this was in fact Phineas Gage. Now, this was proven by comparing it to a life mask that had been made of Phineas in 1849. This photograph was considered another piece of evidence that contradicted the understanding that Phineas was some sort of wild man. He was not dirty or disheveled in this photo. He was proud and well-dressed. There was no autopsy performed when Phineas died, and his brain had not been preserved, so his skull was the only thing that researchers have had to go on over the years. Continued research into this case eventually helped scientists deepen their understanding that the frontal lobe of the brain is responsible for higher level processing and personality. Thanks to research spurred on in part by Phineas Gage's horrific accident, we now know that the brain has certain parts that control different things, such as language and fine motor skills. We also know that the closer you get to the brainstem, the more basic the functions are, and therefore the prefrontal cortex that is furthest away from the brainstem is the part that handles the more higher level processing. Exactly what happened to Phineas Gage's brain would not be studied in depth until more than 150 years after his death, when modern computer models were made using his skull. A study that was published in 2012 says that the damage was largely in his left frontal lobe, and it's thought that most of the damage was done to his white brain matter and not the gray brain matter. So white brain matter is able to regenerate and grow back, whereas gray brain matter does not. Now, something else that was previously theorized and rejected but has now been considered again is the fact that some of Phineas's symptoms were similar to what we would see in modern cases with things like dementia. Now, just a little quick side note here, there have actually been quite a few people who've survived horrific brain injuries that seem impossible to come back from. So Phineas Gage was definitely not the only one, though he probably is one of the most famous. I'll link an article for you guys that goes over quite a few of those cases. I started reading it, I was like, wow. Overall, despite the exaggerations and the incorrect assumptions, Phineas Gage's case truly played a tremendous role in shaping modern neuroscience. And it reminds us yet again of just how resilient the human body can be. All right, girly, you've been sitting in my lap this whole time. You want to say something to all your fans? Say hello.